Hello and welcome. Today we are talking the Communist Manifesto. Okay, to understand the power and relevance of the Communist Manifesto, we need to first step back and define something so foundational that a lot of people take it for granted: capitalism, right? In its simplest terms, capitalism is an economic system where private individuals or corporations own the means of productions. So they own the factories, they own the land or the resources, and they use those to generate profit. Workers who do not own these means of production sell their labor to earn wages, which they then use to survive. And this arrangement has been so normalized that it often feels like the natural order of things. But as Marxist theorist Mark Fisher argues in his concept of capitalist realism, this sense of inevitability is precisely how capitalism maintains its dominance, right? Fisher defines capitalist realism as the pervasive belief that capitalism is the only viable economic and social system, to the extent that even imagining alternatives feels impossible. So think about how often you hear, "That's just the way the world works," right? That statement reflects a mindset that is conditioned by capitalist realism. Yet this reality is not natural. It's constructed. I used reality in air quotes there. Capitalism, like any system, has a beginning and it can have an end. But to envision that, we have to first recognize the forces that are shaping our daily lives. Okay, so Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto, begins from the premise that human history is the history of class struggle. Okay, societies have always been divided into classes with opposing interests: masters and slaves, lords and serfs, capitalists and workers, right? It goes on. And under capitalism, this conflict plays out between two key groups: the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Okay, so let's break down those terms with a real-life scenario. So imagine a small town with a single massive warehouse owned by a corporate retail giant. Okay, the bourgeoisie in this example are the company executives and major shareholders who own the warehouse and the supply chains feeding it. Their primary goal is profit, which is maximizing revenue, the amount of money coming in, while minimizing costs, the amount of money going back out. So the proletariat, on the other hand, are the workers in the warehouse. So those are the people that are spending the long hours lifting boxes, sorting items, and packaging shipments to keep that business running, right? The workers don't own the warehouse and they don't have a stake in its profits. Their income solely comes from hourly wages, which are kept deliberately low to ensure the company's profit margins remain high, right? So the person who owns the warehouse doesn't want to pay his workers that much because he wants to keep as much of the profit for himself or his shareholders as possible, right? Rather than giving it to the actual employees that are keeping his business afloat. But I digress. So let's zoom in further. Take Sarah, okay, one of the warehouse workers, and she earns $16 an hour. Okay, every shift, she moves products worth tens of thousands of dollars, and her efficiency and labor directly contribute to the company's profits. Yet her paycheck barely covers enough to pay rent and buy groceries and cover basic needs. Meanwhile, the executives at the top earn millions each year and make decisions about Sarah's working conditions from a distance, right? Some of the shareholders may not even know what the company's selling. They may not even have ever stepped foot in the building. And that is not a coincidence or a reflection of that person's individual effort. It is the structural relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? The wealth of the owners depends on extracting more value from Sarah's labor than she is compensated for. And that difference, called surplus value, that is the engine of capitalism. So Marx and Engels don't just critique capitalism, they also reveal its paradoxes. So capitalism is both immensely productive and profoundly destructive. It revolutionizes technology and expands markets and creates material abundance, but it does so at enormous human and environmental costs. right? Workers like Sarah are alienated from the fruits of their labor, reduced to a cog in the machine, while the drive for profit leads to these cycles of environmental degradation and social unrest. So consider today's world. In the United States, fucking 3 billionaires hold more wealth than the bottom half of the population combined, right? If we're talking like net worth. So globally, millions of workers toil in these unsafe factories, producing goods for consumers who don't actually consider the conditions in which those things were made, right? And think about the rise of gig work. So like the side gigs, your side hustles, with its lack of stability or benefits or fair pay. These show how capitalism continues to adapt, finding new ways to exploit labor. And meanwhile, the climate crisis, driven by corporate greed and unchecked consumption, threatens the very survival of our planet, right? And these are not isolated problems. They are symptoms of a system designed to prioritize profit over people. So the Communist Manifesto is not just a critique, though. It is a call to action. It argues that capitalism contains the seeds of its own undoing. So the very dynamics that create wealth for the few also create misery for the many, and this contradiction makes the system unsustainable. So Marx and Engels believe that the working class, united by shared interests, had the power to overthrow capitalism and build a society based on collective ownership and democratic control of resources. And this vision is encapsulated in one of their most famous lines, and this is a quote: "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win." So this statement is both a promise and a challenge, right? It reminds us that the power to change the world lies in collective action. And history is not inevitable. It is shaped by people's choices and struggles. And while the challenges are immense, right, the power of the ruling class, fortified by wealth and just deeply penetrated ideology, it's formidable. But the manifesto insists that change is not only necessary, but inevitable. So capitalism's contradictions ensure that it cannot last forever. So when we think of the billionaires who dominate today's global economy, Elon Musk and Donald Trump provide stark examples of the dynamics that Marx and Engels described. Musk is celebrated as a genius entrepreneur, a man who revolutionized industries from electric vehicles to space exploration. But his wealth, like all wealth at that scale, is deeply rooted in exploitation. Tesla's factories have had repeated allegations of unsafe working conditions and grueling hours and union-busting tactics. And Musk's wealth accumulation depends on a global supply chain that often involves underpaid labor in developing countries, particularly in the mining of raw materials like lithium and cobalt. And his personal mythology, that he's this self-made innovator, ignores the privileges of his background, including the wealth that he inherited from apartheid-era South Africa off the backs of these Black South Africans, and the vast public subsidies that Tesla has received to survive in its early years. And Trump's wealth is rooted in real estate, right, which is an industry infamous for its exploitation of both workers and tenants. And Trump inherited millions from his father and built his brand on leveraging bankruptcy laws, stiffing contractors, and evading taxes. And like Musk, Trump has cultivated a persona of individual success, claiming that his wealth is proof of his superior intellect. Yet his story is one of systemic exploitation, right? Profiting from labor while shirking responsibility, whether by refusing to pay workers or by avoiding the taxes that fund public goods. So both Musk and Trump are emblematic of how billionaires defend their wealth. They champion this idea of trickle-down economics, which is a concept popularized during Ronald Reagan's presidency, right? Reaganomics promised that cutting taxes for the wealthy and reducing regulations would spur economic growth, creating jobs and prosperity for everyone. But decades of evidence show that trickle-down economics doesn't work. The wealth just does not flow down. It pools at the top. They hoard it, right? Inequality has skyrocketed with stagnant wages for workers, even as corporate profits and executive pay soar. And the rhetoric of trickle-down serves only to justify the hoarding of wealth, framing it as benevolent rather than exploitative. So Musk and Trump and others who resist systemic change often argue that inequality is not structural, but a result of individual effort. They claim that anyone who works hard enough can achieve success. And this narrative erases the historical and ongoing exploitation that underpins their wealth. It ignores the genocide of Native peoples, the theft of land, and the enslavement of Black labor that built the foundation of the U.S. economy, right? It dismisses the systemic barriers of racism, sexism, and xenophobia that prevents millions from accessing the opportunities that they claim are universally available. And these stories of figures like Elon Musk and Donald Trump, alongside the failures of Reaganomics, illustrate a crucial point about capitalism, where its immense inequality is not a glitch. The system is functioning exactly as it was designed. The accumulation of wealth by a few is predicated on the exploitation of the many, and the promise of upward mobility often erases the violent histories of colonization and slavery and labor exploitation that built the very systems that we currently inhabit. But this isn't just an economic issue, it's also deeply tied to how we think about justice. So just as trickle-down economics promised that empowering the wealthy would eventually benefit everyone, some movements for justice have mirrored this logic, right? White feminists, for example, have historically prioritized their own rights, arguing that once they achieve equality, justice for others, like people of color, trans people, immigrants, etc., can follow, right? As long as they come first. But this approach, much like Reaganomics, fails because it ignores how oppression operates systemically and intersectionally. So figures like Trump and Musk actively undermine diversity initiatives and deny the reality of systemic inequality, perpetuating this myth that hard work alone can overcome centuries of exploitation and genocide. And this erasure of history serves the capitalist project by keeping workers divided and distracted, right? It creates this illusion that billionaires are exceptional and that their success was earned and that we could all achieve the same if we just work hard enough. But in truth, liberation, whether economic, racial, gender, or whatever, cannot be achieved in isolation, right? Justice, like wealth, does not trickle down. It must be built collectively from the ground up. So the struggles of the oppressed are deeply interconnected, and addressing one requires addressing them all. So the climate crisis, racial injustice, workers' rights, and gender equity are not separate issues, but symptoms of the same exploitative system. Marx and Engels reminded us that we have nothing to lose but our chains, and that remains true today. This world that we want, a world where people and the planet are prioritized over profit, can only be won by recognizing that our liberation is bound by each other, bound together, right? It requires rejecting the myths sold to us by the wealthy and the powerful. And we have to dare to imagine a system built on collective care and solidarity. We cannot gaslight ourselves into not even imagining it, right? There's this moment in Braiding Sweetgrass where Robin Wall Kimmerer is teaching an ecology class to a bunch of ecology students, and she asks them, can you imagine any positive relationships between people and the lands? And almost all of them said no, that humans are inherently exploitative of the land. Yet Robin Wall Kimmerer, as an Indigenous woman herself, she knows that's not true. She knows the ways that humans and the earth have had a reciprocal relationship. But she has this moment where she's looking at these students who are ecology students who have committed their careers to environmental protection. And she says, if you can't even imagine it, what are we doing? If you can't even imagine it, what are we doing? So anyway, as long as we believe the lie that the system works for us, we remain trapped. But once we see it for what it is, we gain the power to change it. So history is not inevitable. It is shaped by people's choices and struggles. And while these challenges are immense, right, the power of the ruling class fortified by wealth and ideology, the manifesto insists that change is not only necessary but inevitable. And capitalism's contradictions ensure that it cannot last forever. So the question is not necessarily whether it will change, but how and when and at what cost. So in today's political landscape, the lessons of the Communist Manifesto feel more urgent than ever. Movements for workers' rights, climate justice, racial equality, and universal healthcare are all interconnected, echoing the manifesto's insistence on solidarity amongst the oppressed. So the text challenges us to think systemically, to recognize that these issues are not separate, but deeply intertwined, rooted in the same exploitative system. And it pushes us to ask, what kind of world do we want to live in, and what are we willing to do to create it? Right? And that's where I'm going to leave us. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.